Our next speaker before we break for lunch is a proud graduate and alumni of the Indigenous Peoples Law and Policy Program, and someone that we've been really fortunate to work with on the issues that the tribe he represents is confronting in the Everglades, one of the most sensitive environmental areas, protected areas in the world. Our featured speaker is Edward Ornstein. Edward is Special Counsel on Environmental Affairs for the Miccosukee Tribe of Indians of Florida. He's going to talk a little bit about the background, the history of that tribe, and its continuing struggle for recognition of its land rights and its unique relationship to its homelands in the Everglades, and efforts by the tribe to bring more control and tribal self-determination over those lands and managing that protected area. So Edward, the floor is yours, and thank you for coming to us from Florida.
Well, thank you very much, Professor. It's a lot easier when I'm zooming in from my office than hopping on the plane. So I appreciate y'all facilitating that ease of access. I'm going to start sharing my screen over here and kind of give y'all a little bit of a background. But before I jump into that, I am a member of the Southeastern Muskogee Nation, a state-recognized tribe in Alabama. I am serving as Special Counsel on Environmental Affairs for the Miccosukee Tribe of Indians of Florida, as Professor Williams mentioned. I'm also serving on the American Bar Association as the co-chair of the Indigenous Law Committee. And I'm pretty sure that the Arizona Journal of Environmental Law and Policy is collaborating on this symposium. And that's really exciting because I was the editor-in-chief of that up until the end of 2022 spring semester. So it's really exciting to be back here and see all those things coming back together. So we're going to start with a little bit of a doodle. So this is sort of a rough sketch of the entirety of the Seminole Wars, which I'm going to try and boil down into about 2 minutes so we can jump into this with enough context to understand the significance of what we're discussing. So the Miccosukee people historically occupied this area up in sort of North Florida, South Georgia, a little bit of Southwest Alabama, and Lake Miccosukee, in fact, is located just east of Tallahassee, Florida. And the Miccosukee tribal town was historically located on the banks of Lake Miccosukee and surrounded by a number of other smaller tribal towns, which sat in the same coalition and held council together, including Sawagley and Tapananalka, among others. And the Miccosukee people were pushed out of their traditional homelands by 1819, the end of the First Seminole War, and most of their allies in this resistance, the Seminoles, which is just a legal term of art referring to those Cimarrones, or renegades or outlaws who had not submitted to Spanish rule in Florida, who had not accepted the Catholic Church or become subjects of the Spanish crown. And if you were a Cimarrones and you were an indigenous person, you were speaking either the Muskogee or the Miccosukee language. Neither of those languages have the sound that the English letter R makes. And so that word gradually became Seminoles, and eventually Seminoles, and eventually Seminoles. So the Miccosukee and Seminole, this is sort of a shared history in this period. And most of the Seminoles were put on this Central Florida reservation, about 4 million acres large, but the Miccosukee went farther south, never signed that first treaty. And lo and behold, the Indian Removal Act came shortly thereafter, pushed out everybody from Central Florida from this reservation. Most were taken through Fort Brooke, which was one of America's first concentration camps. And I don't say this lightly. I say this because Adolf Hitler in his Mein Kampf said, let the Mississippi, or rather let the Danube be our Mississippi. I was very fascinated with this period of Indian removal and how it could be replicated in Germany. And in this period, thousands, tens of thousands of Seminole folks were rounded up at Fort Brooke and taken by ship to New Orleans, and then on to Texas, and then up to Oklahoma, which was at the time called Arkansas Territory. There were some good parts to this history, though. There were some moments where, famous Miccosukee warriors like Abiaki and Tigertail would intentionally get captured. At one point, they actually jailbroke 700 people out of that concentration camp in one day. But by the end of the Second Seminole War, really folks had been pushed down to these truce lines. The vast majority of the population of Florida had already been removed, several tens of thousands, and the remaining population in Southwest Florida was down to approximately 200, maybe 300. And then at the end of the Second Seminole War in 1842, where these truce lines were drawn, this is called the Macomb Truce or the Worth Agreement. It was negotiated by General Alexander Macomb, broken and then renegotiated by General Worth. Subsequently, there was an executive order by President Polk that confirmed these truce lines. But as those of y'all who study Indian law know, if Congress doesn't say it, it doesn't matter. And so it is not a treaty per se. It is not something which has historically been respected by the US government. And so there was a gap between the Second and Third Seminole War, and it was a lot of settler violence. Florida passed the Armed Occupation Act in 1842, the very year that the Second Seminole War ended, allowing anyone who could stake out 5 acres, shoot anyone who came onto it, and hold it for 5 years to be granted 160 acres of Florida frontier. Florida was the original Wild West long before the Western United States that we think of today, like Arizona, was even on the map for the Eastern colonies. And so the Third Seminole War would kick off again in 1855, the consequence of the Secretary of War at the time, Jefferson Davis, who would go on to become the first president of the Confederacy, who had urged his surveyors to aggressively survey the lands of the Miccosukee and Seminole people, squeeze the borders a little bit tighter on this truce. And in fact, he surveyed right through the banana field of Billy Bowlegs and chopped down all his banana trees in the process, leading to the start of the Third Seminole War, which would result in all but 2.5 of the traditional tribal towns of the Seminole and Miccosukee people in Florida getting removed to Oklahoma. Billy Bowlegs was removed, but some of his band remained behind. They were joined a little bit earlier in the Second Seminole War by the last remnants of the Calusa and Tequesta people who had historically inhabited the Southwest of Florida, who had not been removed to Cuba by Spain in the prior century. Bottom line is, by the end of the Third Seminole War, there were about 100 or 200 remaining indigenous people in Florida, primarily concentrated in that sort of dark orange quadrant on the sort of bottom left-hand corner of South Florida. So the situation kind of stayed somewhat stable for several decades to follow because of one big thing. The Third Seminole War ends in 1858. The US Civil War begins less than 2 years later. So the military presence of the United States kind of evaporates out of South Florida, which provided the Miccosukee and Seminole people a lot more breathing room to begin to slowly kind of reclaim their traditional lands. This map is one of my favorites, and it was unfortunately created right before the drainage of the Everglades, but it does show the Big Cypress camps in the Big Cypress Swamp, some 25 of them. These are traditional villages, which would be like a whole extended family. Shows the East Coast camps as well. And it also shows the camps up farther north in Florida around the Indian Prairies and around Fort Pierce and St. Lucie and Indian River. And this shows really one thing, which is that at the time of the 1930s, when this map was created, and the demographics are pretty consistent going back to the 1860s when the war ended, the heart of indigenous presence in Florida had become the Big Cypress Swamp. This was the place that was quite difficult for US cavalry to penetrate. There was also a lot of habitation in this river of grass here, which isn't indicated on the map because a surveyor didn't see it. But these are sort of two halves of the whole of the heart of the Everglades of the heart of the indigenous presence here. Now let's fast forward a little bit, because something really bad happens right after this map gets written, which is that the Everglades gets drained. It gets drained first by the Everglades Drainage District, then by the Army Corps of Engineers. There are now 2,175 miles of canals, 2,130 miles of levees, dikes, and berms. And, that kind of catches us up to what sort of the land use looks like today. And the land use in Florida is very focused on the coasts right now. Right now, you have huge metro area, Miami, Fort Lauderdale, this is like 6 million people right on this tiny coast here. Big metro area up here in Tampa, up here in Orlando. And the population of Florida, which is around 20 million right now, is expected to grow by about 5 million by the end of this decade. So there is an expectation that there will be a squeeze on the remaining natural lands, which are, for the most part, the sort of interior of Florida. And so the tribal lands, generally speaking, this is one of the Seminole reservations. This is one of the Miccosukee reservations. There is a Seminole reservation over here in sort of the urban core, a Seminole reservation up here, a Miccosukee reservation here, a Miccosukee reservation here as well in the top corner. This map is probably slightly outdated, so it doesn't show all of these. But bottom line, the conservation areas are both ringing and including this traditional land. And I showed you all that 1930s map, and it showed a lot of folks in Big Cypress, and they were not pushed out of Big Cypress. And I'm about to tell you why, and I'm about to tell you why it's so important that that remains the case. So in 1974, after someone tried to build the world's largest jetport, in the center of that map, Big Cypress National Preserve was formed, broadly speaking, to stop it. And Big Cypress Preserve, or National Preserve, was formed with a little bit of a Faustian bargain, because you had sportsmen, you had hunters, fishermen, the Gladesmen community, which are descendants of Confederate expatriates who ran down to the Everglades, the tribes themselves, and the conservation organizations, which are very active down here. And that bargain that formed Big Cypress is totally different than what formed Everglades National Park about 40 years prior. Because when Everglades National Park was formed, the tribes were there, the tribes helped survey it, but then everybody got kicked out. All of those camps I just showed you on the southwestern side of the state of Florida were evicted because they began to manage it as wilderness. But in Big Cypress, because there was such a presence of land users in that land, the enabling legislation was created to allow for substantial inholdings to continue, to adopt state hunting guidelines rather than more restrictive National Park Service guidelines, to not designate wilderness within Big Cypress National Preserve, and importantly, to extend a continuing recognition of the traditional and customary use and occupancy rights of the Miccosukee and Seminole people within Big Cypress National Preserve. So that led to the present day, which the status quo, not bad. Because the status quo is that, the border of Big Cypress is like roughly right here. You can kind of see that canal that creates a little bit of darkness that you can sort of visually run up on this side of the map. And then Big Cypress ends kind of around this canal over here. So all of these camps, these are all tribal villages. Each of them has sort of a primary clan, a matriarch from that clan. All of these villages are within the preserve. And not only are there villages, there are ceremonial grounds. There are multiple active ceremonial grounds. There are multiple active burial grounds. So in many ways, the Miccosukee have been very, not lucky, but very successful in defending their right to remain in an area which is now being managed by the National Park Service. And I'll show you a quick, little clip of a tribal member speaking that I think, can maybe capture this a little bit better than I can, because I'm not a member of the Miccosukee tribe. Let me know if y'all can hear this.
Everglades, Big Cypress, that's what protected my people, and we have a belief we should protect what protected us. if for some reason Big Cypress was cut off from us, not only are we going to lose access to cultural resources, trees, medicine, things like that, animals, those families are going to lose that direct connection, and we'll lose that direct connection to our ancestors that were living out there, making their way out there. There's just too much at stake, whether it's resources or cultural connections. We've always faced some form of belligerence from the outside world. That's historically been the interactions we've dealt with. We would have like Fish and Wildlife officers coming into the camps, knocking stuff over their food because they didn't approve that process for them to get that food, even though we were here first, and that's been the tradition how we access the stuff.
So that was a tribal council member, William Popeye Osceola, speaking on the concerns about potential loss of access to this land. And I'm going to tell you why we're now concerned that that loss of access may be imminent. When Big Cypress National Preserve was formed, there were two camps that were pushing for different management styles, and the tribe was kind of stuck in the middle. And one camp was pushing for a lot more trails, a lot more ways to access the system by vehicle, off-road vehicle trails, which, you know, are hundreds of miles long throughout the preserve. And then there was another group that was pushing for more wilderness protections, ways to cut people out. So what is wilderness? And then we're going to understand this map a little bit better. According to the Wilderness Act, the areas which are, you know, qualified to be wilderness are those areas which are untrammeled by man. Those areas which have no permanent improvements, which do not have permanent occupancy. In fact, the language in the Wilderness Act is an area where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man, where man himself is a visitor and does not remain, which retain its primeval character and influence without permanent improvement or human habitation. But how can we declare anything wilderness in Big Cypress? Thinking about that map I just showed you, showing this massive buildup of history of indigenous occupation of this land, which continues to this day and is protected by statute. Unfortunately, that's not how folks are thinking in the administration right now. And so while the current setup of the preserve in many ways is a model for public lands nationwide and internationally, where, you know, tribal members can revive traditional camps, live in existing camps, gather throughout the preserve, do ceremony throughout the preserve, and practice, you know, traditional medicine throughout the preserve. That is about to change. And it's probably about to change a little bit as a result of this 30 by 30 push. A little bit because we're dealing with that same exact fortress conservation mindset that the Maasai are dealing with over in Tanzania. And, you know, Miccosukee is a big supporter of conservation down here. As, you know, y'all saw in that earlier map, those conservation areas can be, in, you know, the right context, a bulwark against continued urban expansion. You know, we like that there's basically a wall between the city and the tribe. But by changing the management approach, there is a threat to tribal access. So that's how we get to this map. This is the map of proposed wilderness in Big Cypress. Everything dark green is wilderness that is being newly proposed by the National Park Service. And just to like emphasize how crazy this is, this specific chunk of wilderness is exactly matched with that map I just showed y'all of tribal camps along this road that go throughout the entirety of the preserve. So in fact, the areas that they are trying to pull people out of are the areas in which the tribe has the largest footprint. And there's, to be fair, there's two different alternatives. We don't know which one they're going to go with. One has less wilderness, one has more trail expansion. This one that has less wilderness adds 83 new campsites and a lot of sacred sites. It's no better. Another 141 miles of off-road vehicle trails. So kind of in between a rock and a hard place, because we reached out to the service, we expressed our concerns, and we were basically told They had a compromise in mind for us, a compromise which, they would give some carve out by a rulemaking from the restrictions of the Wilderness Act. But that's not how legislation works. The legislation very specifically says no human occupancy. It says no permanent improvements. So any kind of rulemaking that would be done by the agency would be sort of a short-term fix that would be very open to challenge and that would sort of undeniably result in the erosion of tribal rights just by introduction of that legal regime of the Wilderness Act, which only came about because the National Park Service in sort of its early days was kicking natives out of traditional lands at the end of the Indian Wars to take them over. You look at Yellowstone, First National Park, that's what was happening there. There were some Shoshone folks who were up there. They went, they kicked them out. They took that land and they said, look at this beautiful, glorious wilderness with no people in it. So we had to take some action. We have now worked on an intertribal letter, which has gone to Secretary Holland. We expressed our concerns with the very idea of wilderness designations, and that, from the perspective of Native folks, as captured by John Trudell, we are literally shapes and forms of the earth. And trying to create an area untrammeled by man, where a bunch of people are living, is quite difficult. And rather than just sending this letter ourselves, we asked for the assistance and the support of other tribes in the Southeast, as well as other nonprofits. And we made sure that this letter had a wide reach. We were happy to see on Monday that we are not the only people in Florida that are expressing our concern about this. Both of our senators joined after our letter, both Rick Scott and Marco Rubio, to oppose the proposed wilderness designations. And so we're kind of in limbo right now. We're waiting to see, are they going to push through this policy, which will directly erode tribal rights, despite the fact that the Biden administration is committed to preserving those same rights? And will we see the expansion, or rather the return, of that fortress conservation approach that we're seeing in Tanzania, which we export it to them, and we're now seeing import it back in this period after the 30 by 30 commitment. And so we are in a time of need, and there are ways you can help. We've been working with the Native Organizers Alliance to put together some public letters that we can be sending to, in particular, President Biden, Secretary Holland, and Director Chuck Sams about this issue. There are so far 24,000 letters which have been sent since Friday, when the option to send these letters opened. So we're very excited to see the level of support that folks nationwide are providing, but it also does seem like there's a lot of inertia behind this push. So, anything that y'all would be willing to do as the public to support, we would really appreciate that. Anyone that wants to reach out to me, and I will send it to the hosts so that they might be able to share it with y'all subsequently. We do have that link to the action letter so that folks can sign on and send that to the administration. So thank you all very much for your time. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak on this issue. And I guess the moral of this particular conversation is that this is not an issue that is happening only outside of America. We originated fortress conservation, and it is coming back home to roost. Thank y'all.